official start. All right. Good morning. Thank you for coming to our webinar on CIS risk assessment method. My name is Phyllis Lee, and I am the Senior Director for Controls. Just so you know, right now we have a workbench community for CIS RAM. Here's information so you can join us. For those of us who are watching in the webinar, you can chat, you can make comments as well as ask questions. Please feel free to do so at any time. So, my name is Phyllis Lee, and we have Chris Cronin, who will be doing the majority of the presentation today. So today, during the workshop, Chris is going to go over what is CIS RAM, why did we come up with it, what are the foundations, as well as how it is that you can do a CIS RAM assessment on your own. So just a couple comments. We at CIS, we understand that not everyone can implement the controls fully, so that's why we're excited about CIS RAM. CIS RAM allows an organization to justify why they do or do not select to implement certain controls. And so with that, I hand it off to Chris.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining. The items that we're going to be talking about as we discussed are the foundations and then some of the practical steps. One of the reasons why we wanted to hold the workshop discussion is that CIS RAM has been out for several months now, since April, and it's been very popularly downloaded and discussed, but we're finding that there are some common questions that we're getting from the public and users about how to do certain parts of the CIS RAM. So we wanted to actually walk you through the foundation so that everybody's on the same page about what CIS RAM does, what its purpose is, why you would use it, and then we'll go into some of those parts of using the risk assessment method that are a little tricky for folks. So we give you some examples of how to get stuff done. The examples will be based on things that we've seen in the field and how we address those issues. So we're going to be talking about how CIS RAM and duty of care risk analysis, DOCRA, work, what they are, and how they support CIS RAM, the CIS controls. We're going to talk about the benefits to information security practitioners and non-technical management regulators and litigators and how they're all equally served by this. Some of the common questions we get are, why do we need another risk assessment method? Very good question. And then how do I explain CIS RAM to others? Then how do I carry on the answer to the first question to the second? The material we're presenting here is in Chapter 1 of CIS RAM Foundations. We talk about the history, the methods of the method, and why we want to use this. So let's talk about why CIS RAM. So regulations, statutes, information security standards, business management all tell us to use reasonable safeguards, but they're not telling us what they mean by reasonable. Forensic investigations should not be the first time we define the word. We found people trying to explain that they were reasonable after the event. CIS RAM helps us define reasonable so that all parties agree. So quick what we mean by CIS RAM and DOCRA. CIS RAM, the Center for Internet Security Risk Assessment method, is instructions for conducting a cybersecurity risk assessment. It conforms to and enhances existing risk assessment methods. So you're going to see that if you're using NIST 800-30, ISO 27005 Risk IT, you can extend what you're already doing to achieve CIS RAM activities. It evaluates risk the way litigators and regulators expect. It speaks in terms of business and provides a lot of instructions, examples, explanations, and templates so that you can immediately use what you're being instructed about. The DOCRA standard is duty of care risk analysis. It's a standard that CIS RAM is based on. It's basically a way to think about risk where we're not talking about probability, we're talking about responsibility. If I can expect a certain kind of thing to happen because of its commonality, are my controls sufficient for that? And are my safeguards not overly burdensome compared to the risk they're there to protect against? So what makes CIS RAM different? Well, I try to talk about CIS RAM in terms of its core ethic. If you're thinking about risk this way, you'll start to get it. It is our duty to protect others from the harm we may cause, but not to harm ourselves more in the process, okay? sort of, and I tell people even more shorthand, sort of a reciprocal golden rule, making sure that everyone is taking care of each other. We're not trying to model the future with CIS RAM. What we're trying to do, this isn't probability, we're trying to compare potential harm against the burden to safeguard against that potential harm. We want to make sure the burden of protection could be anything, not just dollars. It could be anything that matters to any party who could be harmed or overly burdened. This is a qualitative method, but it is measurable. And it creates a common risk language among regulators, litigators, management, and information security folks. So when you look at these things, you're starting to see that CIS RAM is a different risk assessment method than others are doing, right? One of the things we see quite commonly with risk assessment or security assessment methods is they're made to be very meaningful to security practitioners, technicians, and technical managers. That's fine for the people who are trying to deal with those questions as they occur. Risk, though, is a community issue. There are people who can be harmed. There are people who represent those who can be harmed. It can be a board. It can be a regulator. They need to also understand what risk is, right? So we have to be able to do risk analysis that makes sense to all of these parties. If we're stopping, say, at technical managers because security practitioners and technologists and technical managers know how to evaluate a 5, a 6, a 7 over a 25, that's fine, but are we losing the ability to talk to business managers, compliance, general counsel, and outside authorities? So CIS RAM is there to address that. As a quick comparison of what's going on, if you look at the blue columns versus the green columns, these blue columns represent the components of actual risk analysis. The green are those that you see in duty of care, even if there isn't a risk assessment going on. So you look at the security assessment methods from the bottom, maturity models and gap assessments. They're not doing a lot of what we have in risk analysis. They're not looking at the foreseeability of threats. They're not looking at impacts. They're not looking at potential harm that can come to us. As you go up, you see factor analysis for information risk does quite well. Probability does quite well. And the IT risk assessments you see by ISO and NIST are doing quite well. When we get into the concept of due care, is there a standard of care? Are there a list of controls like the CIS RAM controls provide so that we know what we should be doing? Are we evaluating harm to others? Are we defining acceptable risk? Are we defining reasonability? Are we evaluating the safeguard risk? These are other things that we need to be sure we're including so that we speak the language of the world outside of our technical teams, because that's how we're being evaluated for reasonableness. So CIS RAM is making sure we've covered all that. And last on this topic is this concept that people come to us about. They say, okay, CIS RAM, I get it. You figured out this balance thing that's very helpful. Why aren't you using probability? Or why aren't you using fair? Well, if you read the CIS RAM principles and practices carefully, you'll see that you can fit probability and fair into a CIS RAM method. The principles and practices are made to be open this way so that you can. But we're finding that if you're looking for probability, if you're using probability, what you're going to find are really good ways to do sort of enterprise-level aggregated financial risk. So you've got a good sense of what is the potential cap liability for a certain scope. You can get down to the level of some assets to help you determine that. You can think of some risks, but you're thinking in terms of macro concepts there. It's very helpful for insurance carriers, boards of directors, people who need to know cap top-line liability. How about factor analysis for information risk or FAIR? Terrific for deconstructing risks in a consistent way. But you're using, much like with probability, you're using one unit, usually dollars, to figure out what is the impact of the likelihood of a threat based on the vulnerabilities and controls. Very useful, again, for boards of directors and executives if you aggregate, but now you can get into insurance risk engineers, people who help reduce risk in the field because they've got control level views of vulnerabilities at assets where we've got CIS controls really trying to address issues. It's good for technical managers. It's good for internal audit because you've got a nice, clean, easy way to evaluate the potentials of risk. CIS RAM takes those and is actually able to be now we can address all those audiences, but now add general counsel, external counsel, regulators, and litigators because we're saying let's take those practices of evaluation. Let's add something more than just the financial components. Let's add anything that someone cares about. into our risk analysis for appropriate balance, and let's make sure that we've addressed both our safeguards and our initial risks the same way so we can balance them. So it's the right tool for the job. You need to really figure out what questions you're answering before you select the method. So why do risk analysis anyway? A lot of folks will say, I've got a list of excellent controls. The CIS controls, they're the best I could imagine. Very practical, easy to read, can implement, no problem. They're even ordered in a way of primacy. I'm going to look at the first 6 controls before I go on to the others because they provide such an excellent foundation. And again, they're very easy to read. Why would I do risk analysis on top of that? Well, because we're finding that just about any organization is going to find the kinds of conflicts that we see here. I can't implement all controls because there's some restriction in my budget, my capacity, my capabilities. I've got some controls that conflict with other controls. I've got some assets and business functions that might be hampered by the control the way it's described. So we have decisions to make about the ways we can implement controls. So we use risk analysis to do that. But it's not just a good idea, it's the law. If you actually look at the way regulations call out risk, HIPAA security rule, Federal Trade Commission consent orders, Graham-Leach-Bliley safeguards rule, GDPR, NYCRR Part 500, it goes on, and you see it in security safeguards like ISO 27001 and others. They're saying risk for a good reason. No one can write a list of rules that everybody will find effective. That's just the way it is. When I hear people complain that regulators are not very specific with regulations, I think, well, thank heaven, you don't want that because Dairy Queen and a hospital are going to have 2 different needs, right? A professional services contractor and a critical infrastructure organization are going to have different needs. You don't want someone far away from your business writing a set of instructions that you have to follow and everyone else. So what do they do instead? They say, do your risk analysis. Figure out what matters. What are they getting at, though? Not just figure out your own recipe. They're saying you have to think about the likelihood and the impact of things that could go wrong based on what you do, but there's a cost-benefit analysis requirement that we'll point out here as well. You are not allowed to take on a burden that's greater than the risk that you're protecting against. So you have to do a good job defining both risk and safeguards. So not only a good idea, but it's the law. This is brought in by Executive Order 12866 in 1993. Provide a cost-benefit analysis. Make sure that everyone's got a good understanding of what your responsibilities are for protecting public interest, but not so much that it's too great a burden on the organization. Courts. We see this originally was called the learned hand rule, then the calculus of negligence. It's now used as multi-factor balancing tests. Most states have a multi-factor balancing test that looks like the risk analysis in CIS RAM. The idea there is burden should not be greater than the impact, or the probability times the liability is the way learned hand first declared it in 1949. But the courts were using this multi-factor balancing test to determine was there negligence or were people providing due care, or even was there a responsibility to care for others. And information security control standard as well. Do things by risk. This is what they're getting at, cost benefit. It isn't do a gap assessment, tell me how you feel about the gap. It's really think through why this matters, threats, likelihoods, impacts, and then figure out the right safeguard against that based on how risk is for that. So how does this support the CIS controls? Well, imagine on the left, this is what your CIS controls analysis looks like. There are some green checked controls you've been able to implement exactly as written. No problem, can do it. Just so happens that I had some of them working, that's great. The unchecked ones, I've got some issues. I can't apply them to all of my assets. I can't apply them as written because it restricts my business too much. What do? I don't know. I'm not going to guess, don't guess. Do a risk analysis that says, what is the objective of the control? What am I trying to prevent? What is the likelihood and the impact of that? Now let's think through, and we'll show you how this is done. Let's think through controls could be modified to address that risk appropriately. Then you would have certain things that are checked because you apply them exactly as written. You have some things that are done by risk where you see scales. The risk analysis showed you the right way. This is a quick, easy way to show you how CIS RAM supports the controls. In the CIS RAM, of course, those who are familiar with it see a set of instructions, about 140 pages of the most interesting reading you'll ever do. People have asked for an audiobook. We're working on it. There's a film coming out. It's very, very exciting, 140 pages. If you already know the ending, don't share it. Don't spoil it for others. But we also have a 10-page version called CIS RAM Express. It's meant for organizations who just need to know what they're biting into. What are we in for if we do this thing? Or if they have good risk assessment methods, how could they adopt their method so that it fits into the CIS RAM? And then templates. It was very important to CIS as we started this project that what we had was usable. We didn't want anything theoretical. So we actually have templates that you can use as actual work product to show this is how I define reasonable. This is why I define it this way. This is how I declare my risk. This is why I believe this to be acceptable. This is why I believe this safeguard is appropriate and this other one might not be. So hopefully after the movie, everyone's going to be crazy about these templates, and you'll see them in McDonald's Happy Meals. Kids will be crazy about them. But that's really what's in that document set. It's also written for 3 tiers of organizations based on the cybersecurity framework tiers. The idea here is that we want any organization, whether they're simple or they're capable with security stuff, or they're able to handle complex questions like threat modeling, that they all have a way to successfully use CIS RAM. So you're going to see different levels of instructions there as well, which accounts for the length of that first document, really. Before we jump in to the CIS method, we're going to finish this overview and then go into some of the nitty-gritty tricky stuff. We'll take some questions before we get into that, if there are any. What we mean by reasonable risk is that you see observed risk and safeguard risk in the top graphic. The likelihood would be multiplied by the highest impact. This is a value. We'll get into the plain language qualifiers that get behind this in a moment. But if we have a way to evaluate the observed risk, the likelihood times the highest impact to ourselves or others, and we compare that to the safeguard that we would implement to reduce that risk, if the safeguard evaluates using the same criteria as a lower value than the observed risk, then we have what's defined as reasonable. Now, this isn't an invention of CIS. This is actually something that's been part of the multi-factor balancing tests and the cost-benefit analysis we've been talking about for some time. Below that is what we call appropriate risk. Appropriate would be that there's some level of acceptable risk that observed risk could be compared against to say, of course this would be acceptable. Again, this looks just like plain numbers and math right now. There are plain language concepts behind this that make this very useful. So reasonable, we're comparing it to a safeguard with a lower value. Appropriate, we're comparing it to an acceptable risk level that has a higher value. This must be a very interesting slide because we're not able to move from it. Yeah, we've lost our ability to move ahead here. Okay, so before you go to sleep, let me tell you about the great stuff that comes next. There's a bear, and the bear's looking for a home, and it's winter. Okay, no. In reality, what we've got is really the basis for this. What we're going to see is the way we actually start to do risk analysis, but the way we build these meanings. When we see likelihood values and impact values, this is very common in the information security world, to just see numbers. Numbers are helpful for math. They're helpful for comparison, ordering, and prioritization. But there are numbers behind it. If we're talking about impacts, we're going to talk about impacts to ourselves and to others. The impacts to ourselves, we're going to need a plain language way to say, can we accept a certain risk? The way CIS RAM draws this out is we start to talk about something called objectives. What is the organization trying to achieve? It could be profitability, scalability, something that they would use as an indicator of their own success. Then there are obligations. What do we owe others to make sure that they are taken care of? So privacy, protection from harm. And then we talk about mission. What is the organization there to do? Why did they engage in risk with us to begin with? When we have a plain language way of defining mission, impact, and obligations, what we're going to be able to do is now assign values to those where value 1 would be a negligible impact, 2 would be acceptable, and then 3 all the way up to 5. So we'll show that in just a moment. What people find very helpful about communicating in risk in this way is that you're able to use plain language to describe the levels of risk you'll be able to accept and not. Let's give it a try. Yeah, still not. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let's go back a step. So this is the basic kernel of what we're talking about with duty of care risk analysis. Imagine that there are two parties, and we think about harm to us and harm to others. On the left, this is how we're going to describe our level of acceptable risk. On the right, what customer financial privacy would be, the harm to others that might happen. So we might say our profit is what we care about. Those are our objectives. Customer privacy, customer financial privacy are our obligations to others. We're going to want to be able to state, how would we recognize if there's been an acceptable impact to us and an acceptable impact to others? If my profit plan is on track, that's how I would recognize that my profitability is okay. It's acceptably harmed, if any. Now I have to associate that with an acceptable level of impact that others who I'm responsible for would suffer. They would have no financial harm. Now, there are a couple things to keep in mind here. One is that if I'm describing acceptable for me, I have to describe acceptable for someone else. And it has to be on their terms. It can't be mine. The other thing to recognize is I use the word harm. I want people who look at a risk analysis to think about the fact that they could be harming someone, and they have to be conscious of that. So we're going to see that kind of construct come up quite a bit. Then we go to unacceptable. How would I recognize that my objectives are unacceptably affected by a breach? I would be not profitable. If I have a profitability problem that resulted, it's not acceptable. Very clear, right? How would I recognize that there was an unacceptable impact against others? Well, they might lose money or their credit rating might be hurt. These are things that we believe could indicate harm, right? So then we move on to just a cautionary tale here real quick. And again, we don't have, yeah. Oh, next slide. Thanks. Thanks. So here's what we're warning about as a problem. What we don't want to see here are just numbers for a couple reasons. Numbers, especially if it's dollar values, encourage people to just think about how you compare one value to another value, which is a real problem. If I say that I can absorb $5 million worth of pain, I should not be assuming that anyone in the public could absorb $5 million worth of pain. I as well want to be sure that I didn't tell someone I was going to pay $5,000 or $5 million, or I would have endured $5 million worth of pain to protect you. $5 million, $1, I'm not going to protect you anymore. I don't want that kind of statement out there in the public. I want a more qualitative statement that talks about why we're doing what we're doing. People will understand that a little better. Let's go on to the next slide. So we use things like this to talk about the kind of pain we believe we would accept and those that others would accept. So be prepared to compare unlike things, which is one of the important reasons for doing a qualitative assessment like this. Let's move on to the next slide. We'll try to catch up. We need to get practical. So a 2x2 grid isn't very practical for coming up with a variation of scores. When you use probability, you're used to seeing broad scales with a lot of variation. We're going to approach that just a scintilla. We're going to have 5 different values where we can talk about, we can describe what a negligible impact would be against our profit and customer financial privacy. We're going to talk about what an acceptable impact, non-zero, but still acceptable. What if our profit plan was off, but it's within plan variance? That sounds like an acceptable impact to us because organizations have variance for that purpose. How about customer financial privacy? What if there's encrypted but unusable information that's been breached, but it can't be used to create harm? Right? That would be acceptable. We're not comfortable with it. We would invest against it, but we know that sometimes things happen, which is why we encrypt data to begin with. How about if we talk about unacceptable? Well, now we're crossing a line. We would say it's unacceptable if we're not profitable, but maybe we can recover within some period of time. And then it gets high if we're getting close to the edge, but we can invest our way back. Catastrophic if we just can't operate profitably. But we use that same idea for customer financial privacy. We're going to say what's unacceptable to them, what crosses the line. If there's recoverable money lost on behalf of the customers, or their credit rating is hurt among few customers, that's not acceptable. We can't accept a risk that creates that kind of issue. And then they've got a high and a catastrophic as well. But what's happening here is we've got parity, right? We've got acceptable we've got a way to talk about acceptability to us and them. We've got a way to talk about unacceptability to us and them. So that if we select an impact value, we're saying, we think my bad is as bad as your bad, right? Next slide. So what we do, we showed you two columns there. We mentioned mission, objectives, and obligations. We'll talk about what that is in a bit. But mission is why you're here. Why did we engage in risk to begin with? Litigators call this utility. Their objectives, what you're trying to do for yourselves. It's an indicator of your own success. Obligations, what you owe others. And we'll remember to look at each one of those any risk analysis comes by. Next slide, please. Now, we know that likelihood or probability comes into any risk analysis as well. How common is this, or how foreseeable is it? CIS RAM recommends to discuss this in terms of foreseeability for a couple reasons. One is, if you're going to use probability, great, but you have to have the probability discipline behind making that statement. If you're going to put 1%, 2.5%, 5% in front of people who are responding to the risk analysis, they better have a good way of estimating that. If they don't, you're sort of tricking yourselves. If you talk about foreseeability, you're using a term that commonly is used in law. It's basically saying, was this something you should have known about? Given your responsibilities and what could have gone wrong, is this something you should have known about, right? So we say not foreseeable, foreseeable but not expected, expected but rare, expected occasionally, or common. We can handle these in any number of ways, but this is what we're recommending for CIS RAM. You can put variations in place. Just use something that is easily communicatable. All right. Okay, next slide, please. This is what it looks like in what we call acceptable risk criteria. So what we've got is a way to declare a mission, objectives, and obligations, each described the way we laid it out. This is for a retail bank. This is a simplified view. They get more complicated than this, but this illustrates the point. And then the likelihood. This organization is now able to say, if I can think of what an unacceptable impact level would be, and I can see a way to communicate foreseeability in a fairly consistent way, can't I then say a certain commonality or certain foreseeability of an unacceptable impact could help me figure out what's acceptable? So this organization says, if there's an expected but rare occurrence of an unacceptable impact, that's 3 times 3, that would be 9. I would start to invest against that, and I would invest against anything higher. But that also means I can accept anything lower. So let's figure that out. If I have an expected but rare occurrence of an acceptable impact, 3 times 2, 6, I can accept a 6. What's happening? I'm not just using numbers for math. I'm using common language, concepts about what I care about, what I don't care about, what others care about, what they don't care about. And then I'm talking about commonality, and I'm just using the numbers to help me prioritize. That's all that is. But it gives me now a common language way of saying, I'm going to start to invest against things that are expected but rare that would cause an unacceptable impact, right? Now that can be continuously used in a risk analysis so that you're consistently analyzing risk this way. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's a quick example. We'll take questions up to this point, and then we'll start to get into some of the nitty-gritty about how we made some of these decisions. In this case, this is CIS Control 1.1. This is for utilizing an active discovery tool. An organization, when they're using CIS controls, they say, there are a lot of controls here for me to do. I'm going to have to invest in some things. Let me see where I can economize. This tells me I have to utilize an active discovery tool. I have to be able to find what enters my network at all times and get a good sense of what that thing is there to do. The asset would be all routable devices. My owner is IT. I'm concerned about a vulnerability here. I'm using sporadic asset scans. On occasion, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks, maybe twice a week, I scan the network to see if I can see anything I don't recognize. Is that good enough to stand in for Control 1.1? I'm not going to know unless I do a risk analysis. So, and you can click ahead. We've got some, yeah, thanks. Irregular asset scans may not identify compromised systems that join the network and attack routable systems. This could happen. If I'm only looking at my network occasionally, then I'm going to miss opportunities for things to get in and be in my network for a few days before the next scan. I think my impact to my mission is a 2. This was an acceptable level of impact against my ability to provide profitability to my customers. Now onto objectives. Now we're at a 3, and this is unacceptably high. What 3 meant for our objectives is we might actually have our profitability affected, but we could recover it in the following year. Because we think if we actually have a problem, we're going to have to do major reinvestment, It's going to knock us in profitability, but we can recover in a year. But that's now not acceptable for that impact. How about obligations? Well, maybe in the scope of this assessment, they said a system that does this could attack systems and get a few accounts, not many. So we think that's going to be a 3. We don't let the impact stand alone. So we say the likelihood 3, you can click again, would be multiplied against the highest impact. So 3 times 3 is 9. If my acceptable risk is below 9, I can't accept this risk. Right? It's got a foreseeable, even if rare, instance that's going to create an unacceptable impact. I can't accept it. You can click again. So now we select a safeguard. Now we're very used to hearing this concept of residual risk. I'm going to put a control in place, and the residual risk is something less. CIS RAM doesn't make that assumption for good reason. If we put a control in, that control creates its own risk. It can slow business down. It can create inefficiencies. It can block other safeguards. In this case, what we're doing is evaluating and said, okay, what if we actually put in a network access control to address 1.1 the way it's written? If we do that, let's talk about the risk of putting that control in place. A moderate cost would have minimal impact on the budget. Installation of the tool is likely not disruptive. There will be some impact on the budget, but minimal. If you can click forward, our mission impact is 1. I can't see how this is going to hurt anyone's ability to, any of our customers to meet, meet financial performance at market levels. How about objectives impact? Well, I believe that putting in a NAC isn't going to hurt our profitability that much. It could be a bump outside of a budget. The next click, obligations impact, 1. I can't possibly hurt anyone's financial privacy with this control. The likelihood of this scenario is 4. It's expected that this is how things would turn out. My highest impact times my likelihood, 2 times 4 is 8. That's below my acceptable level of risk. Now, this isn't based on some kind of magic. It's based on the fact that I thought through how I define what's acceptable and not acceptable, what's foreseeable and not foreseeable. The math is doing nothing more for me than reminding me what I said my priorities were. So it's going to come in as reasonable because it's following the rules that I said as an organization were reasonable. But the other thing that's very important here is the safeguard's been compared to the control. Now I can determine whether it's acceptable, or it's appropriate, it's below the acceptable level of risk, and it's reasonable. The value of the safeguard is lower than the actual risk itself. All right? And if we bump ahead, we're talking about the principles and practices here. We can move ahead pretty quickly. I want to catch up on time here. So we can stop. For the culmination of this section is just to help you see that the information security community and the legal communities have been using very similar definitions for risk for decades. And we just needed a translator. So CIS RAM, if you can click ahead, CIS RAM is serving that purpose, to find that common binding language that talks about the balance, the due care, the reasonableness in a very practical way. So if we can click ahead, if there are any questions, we can take any. Have any come in online? That means I've been extremely clear, and there are no questions to be had, unless there are any in the room. Yes.
You mentioned on the earlier slide about implementing that control, the network access control.
Yeah.
And your level of impact changed.
Yeah.
But that level of impact you're talking about there was the impact of the control itself, not overall. I guess I was a little not understanding that level of impact, why it changed. In my world, when you have an impact, if you have a data breach, right, and you lose information, the impact's the same before the control or after the control. Here, it looks like the impact changed when you put in the NAC control.
Right. What I'm assuming is we haven't had a breach. It's the organization saying, I'm trying to figure out what I should be putting in place. There isn't a breach in that scenario. Does that help? The organization says, if I put this control in, I can expect my impacts and my likelihoods to be different than they were before the safeguard. Yeah. So we're not. Does that?
I think so. Yeah. This is a little different way than I've seen in other places, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. This is quite a bit different. We're saying the safeguard has its own risk profile, and it's going to be different from the other safeguard. And the reason why we do that is because we need to show that we thought about the potential of harm against ourselves and others and our mission, and we know that a safeguard not only by the nature of what we do for a living, because we've put safeguards in place and we've seen them be helpful in one way and harmful in another, we want to list all those ways they've been helpful and harmful. So, and again, we're modeling. We don't know that that's how it's going to come out. That's going to be how it comes out. We want to be sure we've thought it through before we've tried it. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's jump on to the next slide. So we're going to get into a topic here, asset scoping. We can go through this fairly quickly because the question we see here most, what can we include, what can we exclude? This is a real challenge in the field, but there's one little nugget I want to be sure we get to here. The question we hear a lot about what to include, the public and regulatory bodies are no different, want to know that you've analyzed everything. But we know you cannot actually analyze everything in one assessment. It's too much. And what we talk about here, if you can move the slide ahead, we'll go pretty quickly through the first few slides. Again, you'll see this in pages 17 and 49 for Tier 1 and Tier 2 plus organizations. Why don't we move ahead another slide? We want to think about it when we're scoping what we're supposed to know. We know we're supposed to know everything, but we have to make a quick decision sometimes about what scope we're going to look at first. So why don't we go a slide ahead? So what we're going to do is think about a scope that we can digest, maybe one that has a very specific kind of risk profile. It could be a data center, client-facing applications or services. It could be some kind of business process, a portion of the business that has some kind of logic to it. It's a kind of a container for some purpose. It could be the life cycle of personal information. Why don't we move ahead? What that gives us is an understanding of what to have in scope and out of scope. What we'll quickly do is say, when we mean information asset, we're not just talking about a technology. So the CIS controls focus a lot on technical aspects, but when you look at it, a lot of those controls can be used to reduce risk in these other areas as well. But we always think about assets as people, process, technologies, facilities, information, and third parties, right? So we're sure to include those in our asset scope. Let's move ahead. What we keep out of scope are the things that could not affect that scope. So we have to be, it's just a nice, easy way to make that definition. But we have to keep a note here. Just because we talk about scoping doesn't mean that we're advocating for not looking at everything. What we're recommending, this is not in CIS RAM, but it's important information to know because of how these things are being pursued, that we've got a schedule for how we're going to evaluate everything else over time. And maybe it's just that you're going to incrementally evaluate things after the big risk assessment's done. So let's move ahead. We talk about asset owners and stewards. We can click ahead real quick. These things are covered in the CIS RAM and are fairly well understood. You can click again. Now, we're going to pause here for a moment. Here's a question that comes up a lot. How do I know whether I should use an asset or an asset class? And the item that someone goes to a lot is, say, a server. If I have a server farm of 100 different servers, but I have 500 different kinds of servers, do I have to look at each of those 100 servers that are identically positioned, they have identical risk, they're identically managed? Call that an asset class. If that's an asset class, then you can look at the risk once and say, this applies to all these things of this type. That's going to be one way you get through a risk analysis fairly quickly. What we say for Tier 1 organizations as well is, if you try to look at individual assets, you're going to have a hard time finishing. You might really just want to start with controls, but as you're reviewing your controls, just think about all of your asset classes. We can go on to the next slide real quick. For more capable organizations, you're going to have a more full, more detailed asset listing. You can click once. We're going to highlight something. We're right in the middle. What we're going for really is someone who might say, I've got these things called research analytics servers. It's a class. We might have a group of 10, 12, 20, 100 servers that research analytics uses. That's an asset class. They're all conditioned the same way. I can evaluate them the same way. Click again. There might be an individual server. In this one, we mean App Server 1. OK, someone wants me to move quickly here, I guess. So DMZ's router would be one kind of network equipment. We can click again. And then firewall DMZ, it's a specific asset. So the organization that's at the more complex level will say, I'm going to look at a class of things that are similarly positioned as one thing. It's going to help me get through this very difficult challenge. Why don't we move ahead? I don't know that we're going to have questions on this topic. You can click. Any questions on this? Just wanted to take a moment to talk about that one concept. Let's go on to topic 3, defining impact types. This is challenging. This is the kind of thing that we spend a lot of time with folks. When I'm working with clients on it, there's a joke we tell, and when they think it's a joke, and at the end of the 90-minute session, they say, "Boy, you weren't joking." They say, "Why don't you lay back on the couch and tell me about your life? What are you worried about, and what do you value in life?" And it gets very personal and very psychological. Because we get into the heart of why organizations are doing what they're doing and what kind of harm they can cause others. But this is an important, conscientious thing to do. After all, what are we trying to do in information security? We're trying to prevent harm to ourselves and others. We don't just blithely do that by saying, "I plugged it in, I'm good." We have to understand that we have a responsibility, right? So we want to really think about what it is that we're trying to do. So common questions we get, what is a good definition for mission, objectives, and obligations, and how do I tell the difference? Why can't I just use dollars? And what is the difference between mission and objectives? We get these a lot. So let's click through and walk through that. You'll find this information for Tier 1 organizations in CIS RAM on page 22, page 55 for Tier 2, and page 87 for Tiers 3 and 4. You'll also see in the CIS RAM workbook, you can use these criteria tabs to actually fill in what you've got. Let's move ahead. So what we mean by risk assessment criteria, we've seen the math, right? You can have a number come from 2 different numbers when you multiply them together. That's great. We see things like variations like time and threats going into risk equals impact times likelihood. We've seen more complex breakdowns of risk calculations looking at fair and business risk analysis. The formula implies math, so we want to use numbers, but we also want to be sure that those numbers mean something. So why don't we click up? What we call missions, again, this is the reason why people engage in risk with us. It's a purpose, a shared purpose. It's a good way to think of it. Objectives, what we're trying to do as an organization, what's an indication of success or failure for us. Obligations, what harm might we cause others? So let's click forward and see what that is. One organization, this is a retail bank, they say their mission is, our customers will perform financially better than industry averages across all products. That is a wonderful mission statement. The reason why that's a great mission statement is it says why it was worth it for your customers to engage in the risk with you. That's their benefit, that you're able to provide them. I've never been more proud of talking to corporate leaders when they are able to state their mission in terms that are not describing their business, but they describe the good that they do. That's a very life-affirming conversation to have with business leaders when they say, we are here to do this for our customers or our clients or our partners. You know they're in it for something other than we are here to dominate the world for such and such. Objectives. Our return on assets meets or exceeds annual projections. I love this one too. Why? Well, it's concise. It's also measurable. And the organization is very likely to manage to something like that already. We try not to invent a new metric when we're doing risk analysis. We want to use metrics and indicators of success or failure that the client already uses. So that's a good guide to think through. And obligations. You can click ahead. Our customers' financial information is kept confidential, right? Or we don't want to create harm to them, or its integrity remains intact. Whatever we think could create a harm to others, our obligation is to prevent that harm. So let's move ahead. And, oh, I'm sorry, yeah. So in this note, what did we do? We have definitions that are simple and concise. They describe what the business manages to already. We're not trying to reinvent the business management method here. They can be objectively viewed and measured. So these are going to really help us do a good analysis. Let's click ahead. Because this is, and we've talked a little bit about what this is. We don't want to say get rich and dominate in mission. That's for objectives. Let's move ahead. Objectives, we can be very selfish. We can think about profitability, growth, maintain a certain position in the marketplace, retain talent. These are self-focused, but they're good, right? What I didn't say was $5 million. I didn't say $100,000. I didn't put a dollar up there. I'm talking about what I'm here for, right? Now, if there's a potential harm and someone says, well, why did you do this? And you say, well, it's $5 million, $1. I break at $5 million. That's a very hard conversation to have and look like you were really thinking through. If you say, look, I need to be sure that I maintain X position in the marketplace because if I go below that, I'm an acquisition target. I have to be able to maintain this or I disappear as an asset buy by my competitor. That's a different kind of conversation than $5 million, right? It's a qualitative one. Let's move ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, could you go back one? This is very, very important. We want to send the right message to personnel and the public. When you're doing a risk assessment, you're talking to a lot of people. You're talking to management, you're talking to personnel who are actually on the line doing the work. If we say we can tolerate risk up to this point, we can't harm people up to this level if it's this foreseeable, what are you doing? You're creating a very, very important, powerful message, right? You're helping remind people what risk means. It's balancing what we're trying to do here with the harm that we could create to others. It becomes a very great educational moment if you define this right. And we also mentioned a couple things, again, not having specific figures. Let's move ahead. Obligations. We do want to talk about the harm that might come to others, right? We have to put ourselves in their shoes when we think about how we're defining that. We want, again, simple, observable, measurable. Can I see this happening so that I know it was correct or not? And again, send the right message to the personnel and the public. I want to talk about what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to save others from. Let's move ahead. So here's a terrible set of impact definitions. Go ahead and click. High turnover of beds for a hospital, a nonprofit hospital. High turnover in beds. Is that a goal for hospitals? Yes. It's a practical operational requirement that a hospital has to make sure that they can process people who may be ill, especially those in an emergency situation. How about patients? Oh, you know what? I made a mistake. That was supposed to say patents. That's a terrible mission. So patients is a great mission. We have seen in places in hospitals where they will say, we are here to develop great research and intellectual property. And we are here for developing that. We actually, if we get patents, we can make money off of that. That's a fine thing to do if you're a research hospital. You don't want that to be your mission, because that's how you benefit, not how others benefit. Let's talk about other hazardous objectives. Foundation achieves $5 million development goal. It's actually great for the foundation to meet their $5 million development goal. We don't want to say it as an objective because we get into that comparative again. I didn't want to spend $501 million to save you if I had, I'm sorry, $5 million won, yeah. $5 million is my limit. How about obligations? Regulatory compliance. Is that a good goal? It absolutely is. Is that saying anything about harm to others? No. This is actually stated in a way that helps you. I didn't get into trouble. Well, okay, that helps you, but does it help the people who we're trying to protect? Let's take a look at a better way to look at this. Oh, yeah, we're just repeating what I just said. So let's jump onto the next slide real quick. This is a better way to talk about it. Patient health outcomes. That's a great way to talk about it. That's what a hospital is there for. When I really need to be in a hospital, I need to see a doctor, I will gladly turn over my protected health information. In some cases, they can say, we have no HIPAA controls, and I'll say, take my information, please, take care of this problem. Patient health outcomes is a great mission. Advances in research. These are actually different ways of talking about the other goals, right? Rotating beds and having patents. If we talk about this in terms of advances in research, doesn't that help people? Absolutely. We needed your personal information for research because we're trying to figure out a better way to treat the condition you have. Can you give me that information? Absolutely. It's going to help. Balanced budget, great objective. Why? Well, first of all, nonprofit hospitals need a balanced budget, but my budget's going to change year by year. I don't want to have to change my definition year by year. Click again. How about foundation meets goal for dialysis center? Hot dog. That's a great way to talk about your objectives. This isn't just marketing. This is a way to say, people, this is what we're trying to do. You're communicating to your people and the outside. Let's click again to obligations. Patient's information is secure from improper use, right? That's our obligation. We're going to have impacts against that we'll talk about in terms of harm. So we've got multiple definitions in objectives. That's good. The more definitions you have, that's fine. They describe what the hospital manages to. We're not inventing new metrics for them. They can be objectively viewed and measured. We would know, and we'll get into this as we define further down the magnitude definitions, how these would work. But this is much better because it hits those goals. Before we jump on to the next topic, are there any questions about what we just went through? Oh, thanks very much. Okay. On to topic 4. So topic 3 is a big challenge for organizations because it's a new way to see things. But when they actually get down to trying to define the impact scores, it gets even trickier because now we're telling them, you're going to tell us what's acceptable or not of those impacts. Common questions we get, how do I draw a line between what's acceptable and unacceptable? Really tricky, and there's a lot at stake when you do this. And by the way, when you're doing this, make sure General Counsel looks over this with you because you don't want to declare something for your organization without them knowing and then permeate this thing by doing a risk analysis throughout the company and then find out after a regulatory or a litigation issue that someone was running around with a definition of risk that no one knew about. So you want to actually have general counsel review this. This is covered in Tier 1 on page 24. For Tier 2 organizations on 57. You'll find it on page 90 if you're a Tier 3 or 4 organization. And again, you can use the criteria tabs in the workbook for this. Let's jump ahead. So when we see impact scores 1 through 3, 1 through 5, again, it helps us do math. It helps us prioritize. Whoops. So what we see is that someone might be able to say, once they do the raw math, oh, 4 is obviously more important than 3. Okay, that might help the few people who did the risk analysis. Doesn't help people outside of your team, though. So let's consider how we know whether an impact matters to us or others. Let's talk about these 5 definitions. What if something is negligible? It's unnoticed or it's not meaningful. It's acceptable. It's noticeable, but it's not harmful. Maybe it's not preventable. How about unacceptable? It would not be tolerable. How about high? It can be recovered from, but with significant loss, right? So we're trying to give a practical understanding of what these are so organizations can define them. Catastrophic, can't recover from it. Let's move ahead. This is not scientific. This is not quantitative. It's qualitative. It gives people a consistent way to make these definitions useful so in a way they can communicate to their peers and to others. So this is the way we structure it out for this one organization, right? This was what we used for the bank. Why don't we click ahead and talk about this specialty retailer. Let's give you another example. This specialty retailer, they sell something, I don't know, but specialty, so it's expensive things for an exclusive clientele. We're going to see how they actually will work out their impact definitions, and we'll see how it compares to another similarly situated organization, but who think about this a little differently, both valid. So they stand out in the marketplace for having this sort of unique, high-quality experience. They care enough about their reputation. They already measure its success. They measure the success of the reputation. They intend to expand to more locations, but they have to do it profitably. They have financial information and lifestyle information about wealthy customers, right? So this is the world of reality. This is what we call the environment of risk. So click ahead. So when we see, by the way, when you see in information security standards, in regulatory language and guidance, when you see this takes into account the size and complexity of the organization. Those things that we just saw in the previous slide are about the size and complexity of the organization. So how do they define their mission? Customer satisfaction. We want a satisfied customer, right? Our customers will feel that their total shopping experience with us is the best available. That's a good statement. It works for them. Let's remember what their rules are. It's worthwhile to their customers to share their confidential information because they're going to be satisfied with their total shopping experience. It's simple, observable, and measurable. They already measure it. It sends the right message to employees, customers, and the public. Everyone can agree these are good things to do for a mission. And it's distinct from more self-focused goals. So let's take a look at what those look like. So customer satisfaction. Our customers will feel that their total shopping experience with us is the best available. How do they state that a negligible impact against that harm? Well, if we had an incident or we had made a decision and customer satisfaction surveys remained positive without an increase in stated concerns, that would be evidence that we did not harm our customer experience. How would we define it in terms of acceptability? Well, occasional satisfaction surveys would note less than perfect scores, but it would state that customers still would return. That shows an acceptable impact against the mission. Clearly, this is not a big concern. Let's cross that line now. Let's click again. Unacceptable. Customer satisfaction surveys would show significant concern that the shopping experience is reduced due to an isolated cause. So they're saying there is a way for us to observe an unacceptable impact against our mission. We are not doing what we're supposed to be doing. Now, let's pause for a moment and think ahead. What if down the road someone says, we need a security control in place that requires, let's say, requires your customers to use multi-factor authentication whenever they use the application to check on their orders? Well, okay, our concern here is it's very likely they will lose, our clientele aren't really good with technology. They'll lose that multi-factor authentication thing. It'll be frustrating for them to use what should be a simple experience. It will hurt our mission. right? What are we doing here? We're setting ourselves up to have a business meaningful conversation about whether security controls are reasonable in terms that are perfectly acceptable for a business to care about. So let's click again and look at what's high. Customer satisfaction surveys, which show significant concern that the shopping experience is reduced due to a systematic cause. Uh-oh, this is a real problem. I'm sorry, we got to bring our application offline because there's a concern that multi-factor authentication will be too burdensome, so you can talk to someone by using the phone. We can't use a web app anymore. Guess what? That's going to be a system. This is way too costly for us. How about catastrophic? Customers would not be satisfied with the shopping experience we offer. In other words, why are we even doing the business that we're doing, right? That's the worst case scenario for what we say our mission is. Let's move ahead pretty quickly now. We'll go through this next one fairly quickly, but the objectives definition, profitable growth. Perfectly legitimate objective for a business. Why does it work? Same reasons the others worked. It's an important indicator of their success as a business. It's simple, observable, and measurable. They already measure it. It sends the right message to employees and customers, and it is distinct from their mission, but it supports it. Let's click ahead. We'll go through this pretty quickly now. Click for negligible. Our growth plan would remain on target. Great. If we can think about a risk that has that impact, that's negligible. Next is acceptable. Our growth plan may be off within a fiscal year, but would remain on track annually. Of course it's acceptable. Let's click ahead. It's unacceptable if we miss an annual growth goal or we can't operate profitably in one store. Now we've crossed a line. And you'll see how this creates parity for ourselves and others. Again, for high, we miss annual growth goals for multiple years or multiple stores, and then catastrophic is we can't grow or operate profitably. Clearly catastrophic for a profitable business. There's nothing unfair or untoward or unseemly about that. Let's click ahead again. Now let's talk about obligations. They say that their obligations protect customers' personal information. Excellent obligation. Prevent unauthorized access or use of customers' personal information. Now remember, we're going to want to talk about things in terms of the harm that can happen, right? But it addresses their responsibility to protect others. Let's click ahead. Negligible impact, click for us, and then customers' personal information would not be accessible by those who could harm their customers. That's obviously negligible. Acceptable, let's say we did have some information go out. Let's say there was a list of last names of our customers in any of our cities, but last names. I don't know how that could hurt anyone. That might be acceptable. Let's click ahead to unacceptable. Customer information that could create reputational harm to up to 10 customers, right? This is actually interesting. We've got clients who deal with very elite customers, and there are certain publications who are interested in those elite customers doing business with those organizations. It could be people who are doing high-end property buys and this kind of stuff. You can go walk in and out of a place of business, and there are paparazzi taking pictures, and they accept that risk. But you don't want to know what they actually bought. You don't want to know that they bought under a pseudonym that people can't. People it prevents people from sort of tracking their activities. So maybe there's an unacceptable amount of harm where they could hurt the reputation of up to 10 customers. High might be, if you can click again, customer information that could create financial harm to up to 10 customers or reputational harm for many. And then the last one, catastrophic. Many of our customers' reputation and financial confidentiality is breached. It's bad for them, it's bad for us. Now, if we click again, we'll see that this all comes together. And there's something pretty great that happens. Anything that's acceptable to me, if I use a score of 2, what's going to be acceptable to me is going to be acceptable to any other party. My mission, my objectives, my obligations. What's unacceptable to me is equatable to anything that's unacceptable to anyone else that we've said we care about. What's catastrophic to me is catastrophic to anyone else. I've been able to say I care about me as much as I care about anyone else. Let's click ahead. I mentioned parity, and click again. And equal treatment. So everyone's getting equal treatment on this. And click ahead again. I'm going to point out one thing that's interesting. What about a discount retailer? I'm not going to go through that whole thing again, but watch something interesting. For their mission changes to lowest prices for quality. And they do that because that's their mission. They're serving a kind of a marketplace. They're serving a kind of a product. And they say, if I can get you the lowest prices for quality, I'm going to do that. They're also going to talk about their obligations a little differently. It's less about reputation and more about financial harm. They pose a different kind of risk. But what did they do? They sat for the 90-minute session. They went through the exercise that we just did in less than 90 minutes. At least it felt like less than 90 minutes to me just now. But they open up about these things and they say, our customers could get harmed this way, different from these others. But we're going to capture those differently for different people. Now, let's go back to one of the first things I said. Why do regulators not tell you what to do specifically? Even in these two retailers, where you have an exclusive high-end retailer and one that's trying to provide the lowest prices for the best quality, even they're going to have different requirements. They're going to have different kinds of impact that can create against people. They have different evaluation criteria. So be thankful that regulators aren't telling you specifically what to do. They're telling you to use risk analysis. It gives you the opportunity to say, what matters to me? What matters to others? And let me figure out how best to serve that purpose. All right? So click ahead again. Any questions for us on this topic? This can be very challenging. We went through it fairly quickly like a fire hose. But any questions coming in? OK. It just means that I'm being exactly as specific and clear as I need to be. So that's great. And I think it keeps us on target, too. Let's talk about likelihood scores. Some people say, hey, look, this looks like guesswork. Is there a better way to estimate likelihood? OK, so this is the Easter egg. When people say, hey, there's an Easter egg in the video for the CIS RAM workshop, this is where it is. I'll call it right out. The CIS RAM tells you how to evaluate likelihood, right? And people say, but it's not specific enough. Well, we do that on purpose. There are a lot of good ways to estimate likelihood. You can use probability. You can use factor analysis. You can use the binary risk analysis. There is also a duty of care method that we're going to show, and that we, when the next version of CIS RAM comes out, we'll include it because it's really helpful. It's actually using a method that looks a lot like the ethic that we're showing. Let's move ahead. So you'll find much of this, but not all of this because of the Easter egg, on page 24 for Tier 1, page 57 if you're Tier 2, and if you're Tier 3 and 4, you'll see this information on page 90, and you'll find this on the criteria tabs as well. So let's move ahead. We're defining likelihood scores. Again, you'll remember not foreseeable, foreseeable, expected, common, and current. And people say, well, that's a little general. People are going to have different interpretations of what those mean. So we try to give some kind of clarification about what those mean and hope that we're talking to experienced enough people that they could tell the difference between something that's plausible but not expected or that they believe it'll eventually occur. But let's move ahead, just as a quick refresher. We use foreseeability again. This is language that's used in law, but it gives a common enough language structure that we don't ask people to guess 1%, 2%. It'll happen this year, it'll happen next year. Let's move ahead again. And this is just a repeat of what was 2 slides before. We can move ahead again. OK, so this is the helpful method. So imagine that you can think about the likelihood as a product of two things, the commonality of the attack and the strength of the controls. You see things like this in binary risk analysis and FAIR, but this is a very, very simple construct. Let's say you could see that the commonality of a certain threat is high, and you know that the strength of your control is low. You could say that the resulting likelihood would be high. Not that you believe it's going to happen soon, but you believe that there's a delta between how common something is and how prepared you are for it. That's a duty of care question, right? You don't need the probability math to figure out whether something is common and things are well controlled. What if your threat commonality is low and your control strength is high? That would result in some kind of low likelihood score. This is the logic of what we're going to show. Again, we're not looking at probability. We're just trying to show due care. So let's go a slide ahead. So here's some example commonality scores. Let's say we stick with this range of 1 through 5 for our likelihood scores. And we say, if I'm looking at a data set, like at the bottom, if I look at like the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, if I look at the Verizon breach report or the Veris Community Database, if I look at Net Diligence cyberclaim study, there are a lot of commercial solutions that'll do this too. If I look at the data that's actually showing the causes of threats, and I can break them down by industry, and I can put them into quintiles, 1 of 5, 20% inside 20% blocks of 100. I can equate my 1, again, with, say, 0 through 20, 2, 21 through 40, 3, 41 through 60, and on until we get to 100. Is this a scientific breakdown? No, it's not. Again, this is not probability. We're trying to show due care. How common do I see this as a cause for breaches in the public or in my industry? That's all it's saying. Let's move ahead. let's actually talk about control strength. Now, people will think about control strength in terms of maturity models, right? I don't have any controls. I do things ad hoc is 1. I have a policy. That's 2. I implement my policy and manage to it is 3. We actually find that structure of maturity model is difficult to really attach it to how strong our control really is. We've been in environments that aren't well documented, but they're super robust because they've got really good process and really good tools in place. We're going to talk about this in terms of what people think of as the Deming cycle, though, the plan, do, check, act. What if we're not controlled? That's a 1. What if we have an expert or community control standard that's partially applied? I'm using CIS controls. I've got control 1.1. I'm using it for some of my assets, not all of them. That would be a 2. What if the community control gave me a standard that I apply completely? I'm using CIS RAM 1.1 for all of my networks, so it captures all of the routable assets. That's a 3. How about if I test that control and correct within risk-appropriate timeframes? That's a 4. Again, this looks like the Deming cycle, plan, do, check, act. The 5th, the control is continually improved through root cause analysis. Here's the other very interesting thing between the information security community, management community, and law. That bottom value there is what we call due diligence. You are making sure that everything is operating as much as it can. You didn't just apply a thing. You made sure it was working. Due diligence. So now we've got a score. We've got these 2 scores that we can use together. Let's click forward. Actually, I thought I had a model in there for this. I'll explain it very quickly. If you're doing risk analysis, and by the way, I think we can say we've got a series of videos that show these steps in more detail that will be made available very soon. So we go into a lot more depth about these. I've got some really good examples for what I just showed in there, where we actually changed the template a little bit, so you're doing risk analysis exactly that way. So you'll have available to you this method for actually doing what we just showed. But I'll just state really quickly. If you have a community-provided database, let's say the Veris Community Database or the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, you're going to see some industrial breakdowns. And you're going to see others provide this too for free. FireEye does it as well. And there are some good commercial ones. But if you're looking, when we talk about the percentage of commonality, you just look at how common something is. It'll help you know what quintile to put it in. So every time you're doing a risk question, you'd say, this is a risk question about malware. How common do I see malware appearing, maybe for my industry or the public in general? Oh, it's 42%. That's in my 2nd quintile. That's a 2 quintile. How is my control capability? I'm at a 3. I've got malware in, but I'm not testing it to be sure it works. My 3 and that 2 will give me my resulting likelihood score. We've got a good example that we'll be able to show you in the videos that are coming out soon. And those who are part of this workshop will be able to get access to that soon enough. Any questions on that? Just using these 2 commonly available factors to give you likelihood in a nice, consistent way. Let's move forward into topic 6. We're talking about risk acceptance. We talked about this a little bit. How do we know when a risk or safeguard is acceptable? So let's take a look at this slide pretty quickly. We can move ahead. Tier 1 organizations. We'll see this information on page 25. Tier 2 organizations on 59. Tiers 3 and 4, we'll see it on 92. And again, you'll see this on the criteria slides. Then after this, we'll actually do some fun risk analysis. Let's jump through. The principles behind accepting risk. We want to conscientiously define levels and boundaries of tolerable impacts to ourselves and others. We want that to be a consistent definition, too. We want to have clearly defined levels of likelihood. We want people to know what we mean by commonality. Because we have those already, we've developed them, then we've got the means for an acceptable risk criteria. So let's jump up. In the case of, this was the premier retailer, right? They have an option here. We want to talk about why organizations make certain assumptions about their acceptable level of risk. If you've got a clear definition of what an acceptable and unacceptable impact is, you've got half the battle done. But now we've got likelihood. We have foreseeability, we have expected, we have not foreseeable. What is the right level of likelihood that we should apply to unacceptable impacts to draw the line? This is something that every organization has to think through themselves. This is one of those lie down on the couch and tell me about your childhood moments. They might say, let's see, if something is a level 2 foreseeable, it's plausible but not expected that would have an unacceptable impact. They've got to ask, will we invest against that? Or would we be more comfortable to say we're going to invest against 3 expected, where we're certain this will eventually occur, that you have an unacceptable impact? These are discussions that you have to ask as an organization yourselves. Where are we comfortable? Some will say, can I try to see what 2 times 3 looks like at first, and as we review the risk assessment later and see how things fall out, see if we really would make those investments. That's okay to do, but just make sure that at the end you're using plain language, because you've defined what 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 mean. You've defined what those are. You have to now have to make a conscientious choice. Are you going to invest against plausibility when it's not expected, or plausibility or you're certain it's going to eventually occur? We have one client that said, I'm only going to accept 1 likelihood times a 2 impact. They weren't even going to accept anything below that line. They said, we get where we're going. We've got a margin of error that can sway real fast, so we're going to be as conservative as we can be. And what was also interesting was they made a distinction in terms of impact. They made a distinction between an event that could happen once a second or twice a second. So they were working that kind of precision. So we see a lot of variety in how this is answered, but once you've made those definitions of what your foreseeability and impact scores are, you'll have to ask yourself, where do I want this to fall? Let's jump ahead real quick. Yeah, so you see the way they describe that is, if they're settling on 2, their likelihood score threshold would be 2, impact would be 3, their risk threshold would be 6. They can accept anything less than 6. But they're going to invest against 6 and above. Real quick, how that looks, when someone evaluates a risk and they say, I've got an expected, we were reviewing the risks, someone looked at this scenario we laid out, they called out a threat, and they said, you know what, that's actually expected that will happen eventually. I can't see how it couldn't in our environment, given the things that we've been talking about. But I think it would create an acceptable impact. So we are certain that what will eventually occur is our growth plan will be off within a fiscal year. Customer information that could not harm them could be accessible. That's acceptable. Your plain language fits the math nicely because of how you structured it. Let's move ahead. An organization can choose 3 just as likely. But let's move ahead again. And any questions about this before we actually start to model risk analysis? This gets to be the fun part. All right, let's move ahead. So what we're doing here is demonstrating risk analysis to determine whether risks are acceptable and safeguards are reasonable. So let's move up one more slide. You'll find this for Tier 1 organizations on page 27, Tier 2 organizations on 61, Tiers 3 and 4 on page 94, and you'll see that we're using risk register tabs for all 3 levels. So why don't we move ahead? Quick refreshers here. The CIS RAM principles. We must consider the interests of all parties that may be harmed by the risk. If we're just considering ourselves, we're not going to do a good job explaining why we thought something was reasonable. Risks must be reduced to a level that authorities and potentially affected parties would find appropriate. I think we've got a clearer understanding of how we can do that. And 3, safeguards must not be more burdensome than the risk they protect against. Okay? So let's jump up one more slide. And remember, these were our structures for what reasonable risk was. It's reasonable when the safeguard risk is below the observed risk. It's appropriate when the observed risk is lower than acceptable risk. One more slide. And then this was the acceptable criteria. Here it's 3 times 3. So one more ahead. Thanks. So now this is a blank risk register. This doesn't look like what we've got in the tabs, but it's got the essential fields. This is a situation where an organization knows they've got to implement Control 16.3. They need to have multi-factor authentication in place. Let's click ahead and see what we got. The assets here are authentication for the administrators, the systems administrators, human resources, and finance. So click ahead again. The owner here is IT. They own the authorization process, or the control process. So vulnerability, credentials might be guessed, which is why we use multi-factor authentication. But we're not using it in this case. So we have a threat of unauthorized use of credentials. The risk would be written out like this. Personnel who are permitted access to office spaces may gain credentials of privileged users, HR or finance. These unauthorized personnel may abuse access to thousands or millions of accounts. So someone thought through what problem they're trying to address with multi-factor authentication. They're not using it, so what does the risk look like? So they work it through using the risk assessment criteria we just looked at. What's the mission impact? It is 3. They think that their mission, their ability to satisfy their mission is now unacceptable, just crosses the threshold. Objectives, 4. They think they're going to have a problem with profitable growth because they're going to actually create a problem where users are going to see that they might not be trusted. They have to put a lot of money into correcting things. They think their objectives would be hurt significantly but recoverable. Obligations, 5. They think they're going to actually hurt customers extremely to the point where they might not be recoverable in this scenario. So let's take a look at what the likelihood was for the scenario. 2. They thought it was plausible. They thought it was foreseeable, but it wasn't expected. Wouldn't be plausible, but foreseeable. The way this calculates out as a risk score is 10. So even if someone says, look, I don't think that kind of thing, it could happen, it's foreseeable, I just don't expect that it would, that's not a reason to not do something if you think the impact could be very high. So they say 10 is above our acceptable level of risk, which is below 9. Let me try a risk treatment here. Let's click. What if we use multi-factor authentication on accounts for privileged administrators, HR, and finance staff? Sounds good. Let's click that out and see how it works out. We've got a mission impact of 3 still. If there was a violation, if someone did get through this, what if we went through objectives? Or what would we calculate for objectives? Click again, 4, and then 5. So we don't think if someone was able to, let's say now get a hold of, this was the scenario. You've got your multi-factor authentication key fob at your desk where your computer is, and you walk away, and someone comes, and the risk looks a lot like what it did before. But let's say what they thought about the likelihood of the scenario. 1. They thought it was actually not foreseeable. Why? Because they said, what if we put the multi-factor authentication on phones, which are password protected? So now they're thinking it's not going to be foreseeable. What if they were using key fobs that sat solo and just showed the 6-digit figures to whoever could see? The same kind of risk as we had with an unattended computer if someone just left their key fob there. But they're going to put it on a phone. And the risk score, the highest impact times the likelihood, if we can click ahead, is 5. That's acceptable. Now, if they said we're going to have it on the key fobs where anyone can read it, their likelihood would probably be very similar to what the original risk was. So it would be unacceptable risk and not lower than the actual risk. So that's a nice, easy way to describe why you would use this multi-factor authentication method. Let's click ahead. In the second example, let's click. What if we're just looking at admin accounts? In this case, the owner is IT. Vulnerability is using face recognition. Okay, so they said, we don't want to use an MFA. We want to use face recognition because we have a concern about the security of the way we're actually getting our 6-digit codes on our phones, and we're a big target. So what if we use face recognition? And then someone says, are you kidding? I saw in a YouTube video someone actually using a molded face to get facial recognition. We can't use face recognition. We can't use that kind of bioscan. So now they get into this kind of a geek argument that happens in dark corners a lot. And I've heard them all. I've participated in most of them. So the threat, what are we saying the threat really is here? Well, a mask might be used to spoof MFA. I saw it on YouTube. Cool. What's the risk scenario you're actually telling me would happen? A hacker with a replicating mask, admin account credentials, physical access to the admin's machine could gain access to the network and compromise the network information. This is what you're telling me? Let's walk through what we think the mission is. 3, we think we could get hurt that much. How about objectives? No surprise. 4, I'll bet obligations is 5. Looks just like the last scenario. What's the likelihood of that scenario? Not foreseeable, is it? So now let's click onto the risk score. Highest impact times the likelihood is 5. What can I do? Can you click ahead? I can accept that risk. I can accept the risk of using facial recognition. Thank you for that entertaining YouTube video. Let's actually lay out the risk. But we didn't just flippantly say, you can click ahead. We didn't just flippantly say, that's not plausible, forget it. If you thought it was a concern, I'm going to work it out. But we see things like this happen a lot in organizations where an executive says, I can't be required to use MFA because my clients are important. And if I can't answer them right away, then this business goes down the tubes. You say, that is a very important thing for us to consider. Let's work it out. I'm not going to ignore what you just said. It's important. Let's work it out. But you're using that evaluation on the same terms you've used any other evaluation. It's not ad hoc. Let's click ahead again and take a look at one more example here. Control 13.8, manage systems external removable media's read-write configurations. Right? This is a requirement that says don't allow use of these devices, but if you do, make sure that the volume, the USB storage volume, is encrypted. So here we've got a pharmacy. They're part of this. They're part of this retailer. This is part of the discount retailer. They've got a pharmacy group that operates, and they've got what are called compounders. Have you seen these? They're really great. They help cut costs. A lot of organizations that are trying to reduce costs for their customers and themselves will use compounders. People come in with a prescription. They say, I need this much of this much of this. A compounder can custom make your prescription for you, and they're used at organizations like this. So they've got these pharmacy records at compounders. Anyone who's got a prescription that runs through it has their PHI in it. The owner here, if you can click, is the pharmacy. The vulnerability, if you can click, compounders cannot encrypt DVDs. So what happens is that if you're at a pharmacy, you're allowed to say, I want all of my records moved out. I'm going to move to another pharmacy, or I'm already at the other pharmacy, just move all my records out. Where it's possible, they do it. Some organizations will actually hand deliver the records to say, you now have these, right? We've seen compounders with terrible security on them, including inability to encrypt what comes out of them. So the threat here, if you can click, is lost or stolen DVDs. If someone loses their DVD, it's really on them, but we don't want to hand them this stuff. Things could be bad for us and them. We want to protect them. The risk scenario is customers request their records and choose the option to receive the records on DVD. The DVD might become lost or stolen. Let's take a look at the mission impact. 1, if this were to happen, it would not hurt our ability to provide discounted or quality goods at a good price. How about our objectives? 1, we would not stop our ability to grow profitably as a discount retailer. How about our obligations? 3, we could have few people have their PHI exposed by doing this. What's the likelihood of the scenario? 4. Why do they know it? Because their customers are not necessarily sophisticated technology users and will forget things. And they'll say, I lost my DVD, now what? And you gave me an unencrypted DVD, this is your fault. This is actually foreseeable and common because our customers complain a lot on the phone. How many of us have worked retail back in the day? Do customers complain? Customers complain. 4 out of 5, right? So likelihood of 4 times obligations of 3 gives us a risk score of 12. So someone might say, look, if I'm giving them a DVD, that's on them to protect it. Okay, but when I evaluated this using the same criteria I evaluate everything else with, this is unacceptably high. So let's see what we can do about this, because the compounders can't encrypt DVDs, so click ahead. Someone says, shut down the compounders' read-write capabilities or buy new compounders. So compounders are about $1 million each. These are expensive things. Now, you know what that's going to look like. Not great. If you shut down a compounder's read-write capabilities, and we're supposed to give clients their information in a format that they can take, like a DVD, that creates another problem. Let's see how this risk looks. The mission impact would be a 2. Why? Because we're supposed to be able to provide goods and services at a good price. If I'm starting to replace all my compounders, my prices are going to go up. So that's going to hurt my ability to provide quality goods at the most reasonable prices. How about my objectives? My objectives are going to be hurt significantly here because I'm spending $1 million per store on a new compounder just so I can encrypt DVDs. How about my obligations impact? 1, everyone's safe, but I'm overly harmed here. What's the likelihood of the scenario? It's going to be 4. It's expected that if I have to replace a $1 million compounder in every retail site, I'm going to get this turnout, which is now 12. That is not either acceptable, because it's higher than my acceptable level of risk, and it's not reasonable. It's not lower than my risk. I can't accept that. Thank you for the suggestion, though. It was awesome for being team player. We've got to try another recommendation. Let's try another recommendation. Click ahead. Same risk. You can just click ahead through here. You can just keep clicking until we fill out the top table. It's the same risk, the same mission, impact, obligations, and likelihood. Now let's click ahead for the treatment. What if we say, let's encrypt the files and burn to DVDs on a secure workstation that's connected to that? Can we try that? Is that okay? Well, let's provide a key to the customer via email as well. Okay, that might be a little dicey. But before we go much further, let's look at what we're trying to say here again. If you look at the way Control 13.8 is stated, manage systems external removal media devices, we're not actually doing that. We haven't done anything different about the ability for this thing to write out on DVDs or to encrypt. We've tried something else. We said, what if something else takes this role. What if we make sure that something else can handle this role? That's not exactly what 13.8 means, but can it meet the objectives? I think so. Let's see if it meets the risk. Let's click ahead again. The objectives impact would be not harmed. Let's click again. How about obligations? We might have people, in the way that obligation was stated for 2 is, I believe, some information that might not be harmful would come out. Let's say the person's name on the DVD, Jane Smith on a DVD. Is that information about Jane Smith? It's got her name on it. Is it harmful? No, can't be. So how common is that scenario? 3, it's expected that it would go that way. It could be 4. So likelihood times the highest impact 2 is 6. Is that acceptable? Yes, it's below 9, which is our target. Is it reasonable? Yes, it's below the risk that we were concerned about. So we go through all these original preliminary steps of being careful to define mission, objectives, obligations, so we fairly describe what we're here to actually do that shouldn't be compromised. What we're trying to accomplish as an organization that could be overly burdensome if we were hampered by it, and what others might suffer. And then created a structure that allows us to very clearly declare levels of acceptability or unacceptability that once you apply them in the rationality of what we've always seen as risk equals impact times likelihood, comes out to actually a very usable way to not just evaluate whether a control is appropriate or not, but to communicate to others why we believe it to be so. All right? So we've reached the end of the workshop. Are there any questions coming in, or have we been so clear that, that there's nothing left to the imagination? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for being part of this and for participating. You'll be getting news fairly soon about the available videos that show a lot more detail about each of these steps that actually give you not just more samples, but actually give you a lot more refined approach about how some of these more difficult things and definitions are to develop. But thank you again for participating. I think we're done.
Good job.
Thanks. A couple snafus there.
Yeah,
Whoops. Whoops. So I'm looking around the room thinking, you've seen this, you've seen this, you've seen this.